Hello everyone. Today we're going to discuss the effects of inflation on the economy. We're going to see how inflation affects the economy, how in fact inflation leads to an economic slowdown and wealth transfer. The main points that we're going to see in this presentation are: what are the effects of inflation on the economy, or how inflation affects the economy, particularly how inflation leads to a deflationary credit cycle and eventual credit destruction, how inflation then leads to an economic slowdown. We'll also talk about the inflation tax, how in fact inflation leads to wealth transfer from poor to rich. To set the context right, you can check the last presentation where we had an initial discussion on inflation, especially on the good things about inflation, wherein if the inflation is not widespread, small and not consistent, it acts as a signaling mechanism. Also, inflation in this scenario acts as a reward to risk takers in the economy. Here we will be talking more about the bad and ugly part of inflation in detail. Before we start, we'll have a brief context of the modern monetary setup, where we'll discuss how money is created and grow in the economy. Under this system, let's see how money is created in the economy. A person goes to the bank to get some loan. Now the bank takes from the person a collateral, which can be an asset, inventory, and in lieu of that, the bank grants him a loan. And voila, money is created in the economy. Because as the name suggests in this system, credit is money. So remember, in this system, money is created by the banks out of thin air. Deposits are just needed to balance the books of the banks. And remember this, deposits are not needed to create money. They are not. In fact, deposits are an outcome of the money created by banks out of thin air. For more details, check out the money presentation. Again, the link would be in the description. Now let's see how the money grows in this system. So the person who has taken the loan from the bank invests in his business, and his business luckily grows. Now the person sees future demand and he approaches the bank for more loan. The bank, since the business already has grown and the person has a bigger collateral to offer, the banks give him a bigger loan, and voila, more money is created in the economy. But now comes the problem in the form of inflation. How? Let's see. Now, the person has taken loan from the bank. This time he also invests in business. However, this time, because of some external circumstances or due to his own wrong decisions, the business turns out bad, a malinvestment. Or the person wrongly speculates in the real estate market. He invests money in the real estate. Or worse, he just spends it on himself. In all three scenarios, the goods or services are not created as they should have been in the economy. However, we do have credit or money supply that has already been created in the economy. So the economy has more money supply than goods and services, and due to this mismatch, inflation happens. Let's look at the second scenario. This time again, the person either invests his money in the business, which unfortunately doesn't grow. He invests the money in real estate, which, luck good for him, rises in price. This asset price rise. In both circumstances, he approaches the bank for more loan. The bank grants them a bigger loan in both cases. This, at least in the former case, is known as what we call evergreening of loan. What happens is, with this bigger loan, the person pays back to the bank the old loan, and the remaining money he uses either, let's say, for putting up his old business on road, investing again more in the real estate market, or the third scenario that we just saw, investing or spending the money on himself. In all cases, again, the required goods and services are not produced, but more credit is created in the economy, leading again to more inflation. So, points to note: if this phenomenon is limited to a few companies, if there are few bad apples, that is, or a sector, then other companies in other sectors can pick up the slack and cater to this demand that was not fulfilled, thus reducing that supply-demand mismatch and keeping a lid on the inflation. However, if this phenomenon is more broad-based, long-term and overall in the economy, then inflation is more entrenched. That only means one thing: there are high levels of malinvestment in the economy. And this will, as you'll see in the further slides, leads to wealth transfer, ultimately deflation, and economic slowdown. We'll also talk about the government actions in conjugation with this. Now, what happens to credit that was generated by the bank and was causing inflation? Now, so let's say the business or the person has failed, and even now the evergreening of loans that was happening for him has stopped. The asset market that was growing has collapsed. He has no money no longer to invest further. And in third case, anyways, he has wasted money, has spent on himself. Now a bank is asking for their loan back, but he has no money to return. Then what happens? So here's what happens when he has no money to return. The banks would take over the factory, or for that matter any asset of that person, into their custody and sell it over to a third party. So in effect, wealth is being transferred from person A to person B. During this transfer, there will be some credit destroyed in the economy, as the market value or the value at which the bank sell over the asset to the third party will not exactly be the market value. And so hence some deflationary pressures will be put on the economy, with leading to some slowdown. Let's say the second scenario. In this case, even the collateral value is insufficient for the banks to recover the loans. Then what happens? Enter the investors. They will start losing money. How? Well, because here the bank has to issue more equity, or in some cases debt also, to raise the money to cover its losses in the balance sheet. That means more credit destruction takes place, and this can lead to a bigger economic slowdown. And now the third scenario. In this scenario, even the equity value of the bank is not sufficient to cover its losses. In this case, the federal government has to step in. They have to buy equity into the banks. And how would they do that? Well, they would use the taxpayers' money to do that. They will use the taxpayers' money to buy equity into the banks. Hence, as they are shifting wealth from the taxpayers and buying equity into the bank, this will lead to a lower demand in the economy and hence a lower slowdown. Also, since they're using taxpayers' money to buy equity into the bank, it's very important that punitive actions are taken against people who are responsible for this mess. Otherwise, this phenomenon will repeat itself. And why the intervention of federal government is required? Because otherwise, we are in for a fourth scenario, which is a bigger mess. And that is, In this case, the depositors, or in other words, the common people, would lose money. This would mean the banks have to write off large amounts of loans from their balance sheets, causing enormous deflationary pressures on the economy and an eventual economic crash. Before we end, some more points about inflation. Although not politically prudent, inflation also acts as an inflation tax on its citizens. Why? Because the government's indirect revenues will increase due to inflation as the prices of products in general increase. Also, the direct tax revenues of the government will increase because, at least nominally, the wages of people will rise. Also, as mentioned in the last presentation, inflation happening due to supply shocks, as was the case in 1970s, if sustained for long due to wrong policies, would lead to a wealth transfer, this time from consumers to producers of that commodity, eventually leading to an economic slowdown. So the conclusions. Inflation, if long in terms of magnitude, large and consistent over a period of time, leads to an eventual deflationary collapse, or in other words, a credit collapse, which would then lead to an economic slowdown, a recession, or even an economic collapse, depending upon the duration and the extent of the inflationary cycle. And during this entire cycle, as it carries on, wealth is constantly being transferred from poor and middle class, who are actually owners of their own labor, to the asset owners, who are usually rich. So thank you very much for watching the presentation. Do subscribe if you like such content, and comment in case of any queries. Thanks a lot.